welcome to the Champion Brief November-December 2025-2026 Public Forum topic analysis. As most of you probably know before we begin this video, the topic is the United States federal government should require technology companies to provide lawful access to encrypted communications. So what is the core of the debate? With most debate topics, there are two key elements of contrast, whether it be the previous topic on economic growth versus economic autonomy. This topic is a clear privacy versus public safety. The AF is going to be arguing that affirming enhances public safety, while the NEG is going to be arguing that affirming degrades privacy. Now, most other arguments will be kind of just more niche and specific versions of these two major themes. So it's important when you're writing your affirmative and negative cases, you take both of these things into account. But also, let's talk about what the resolution pretty much is. Going back to here, it says the United States federal government should require technology companies to provide lawful access to encrypted communications. So let's just go down this. Let's depict what each part of the resolution is saying. The actor is the United States federal government. As most of you who have done previous debate topics, this is a common actor of the U.S. So the U.S. should require technology companies like WhatsApp, Signal, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, etc. to provide lawful access to encrypted communications. What does that mean? That basically means when you've probably used things like Instagram or WhatsApp or other messaging services that are encrypted. What that means is that if I send a message to my friend on WhatsApp, only I can see that message and my friend on WhatsApp can see that message. WhatsApp cannot view the message, nor can anyone else. And that's what is called as end-to-end encryption. So what this topic is saying is the U.S. government should require companies like WhatsApp to provide lawful access to those communications if needed, but if the court deems it lawful, right? So a good example of this, which we'll get to later, is the San Bernardino case, which was basically where Apple, the court forced Apple to assign a warrant to specifically access a terrorist's iPhone, but Apple refused to do so because of encryption violations. So going back to this slide, the main two things you want to keep in mind is public safety and privacy. This is also going to be important because when it comes to the weighing in the back half speeches, because the weighing is almost always going to be some form of public safety versus privacy. Now, obviously, privacy itself isn't that big of an impact, but you can probably make privacy adjacent arguments like authoritarianism and free speech that have bigger impacts. So let's understand what lawful access is. Lawful access enables governments to obtain encrypted data with a valid court order. That's what it means by lawful access. This is also going to be an important part of the resolution for the affirmative to use throughout the round, because a common negative argument is that the government is going to abuse its power and use it too much. But the affirmative can come back and make sure that everyone knows that it's lawful access, which means that the court must issue a warrant before they can go and access it, just like how a court must order a warrant before the police come and search your home. The biggest issue with the end-to-end encryption is the idea of warrant-proof encryption. That's pretty much that in the end-to-end encryption, it doesn't matter if the government has given a warrant for that information, nobody can access it because it's encrypted. And that's why, that's part of why we're debating this topic, because a lot of crime is happening and is quote-unquote going dark. And that's, a lot of crime is just going underground, so the police cannot do anything about it. All right, so let's talk about specifically the real-world impact of this topic. A lot of the crime that happens in end-to-end encryption is child exploitation cases, human trafficking investigations, and there's some other costly alternatives. So because human trafficking investigations and child exploitation cases are often done with end-to-end encryption, it takes a long time and it delays getting justice for victims who are abused of this. That's why this is going to be a common theme for affirmative arguments to run, because it's solving crime. Also, I think specifically child exploitation cases and probably sexual trafficking would be particularly helpful in like a lay case, because you can make a strong rhetorical appeal to saving, children and, sexual violence victims, people who are generally more susceptible to being, victims of violence. So this is a piece of legislation called the Lawful Access to Encrypted Data Act. So as you can see, there are a couple of senators that have introduced legislation, and the core requirement is effectively doing the AF. So it's saying tech companies must assist law enforcement in decrypting data following a valid warrant from the court system. So effectively just doing the AF. So this is kind of explaining the status quo of what's happening within, Congress and the government to try to resolve this. And this is also kind of why we're debating this topic now. Most debate topics in public forum have some sort of policy impact and relevance to the real world. Like, for example, the previous topic in September, October, if you watched that video we did about the UK joining the EU, there was a lot of current, political ambivalence and regret about leaving the EU, and that's why we debate that topic now. Similarly here, we're debating this topic now because kind of the forefront of, current legislation being passed is about like encryption in messaging. So the biggest problem, which you've probably already heard, which is called the golden key problem, is basically the issue is when this has been tried in the past with the 1990s Clipper chip or the NSA's PRISM detection system, where they have tried to make lawful ways to access encrypted communication. But a common neg argument and what's happened empirically with some of these attempts from the US is it creates a vulnerability risk, right? Because effectively when these companies have to decrypt this encryption, it makes the encryption weaker and hence cybersecurity as a whole weaker. And what we call it a backdoor. So any backdoor creates security weaknesses that can also be used by hackers, foreign adversaries, and malicious actors. So one thing that makes encryption super secure is that nobody can get into it. It's very difficult to hack, but that also means that people are able to use it to avoid law enforcement. So that's kind of the balance that we have to, that's in this debate, right? AF is gonna come up and say, hey, people are using this to go dark and avoid law enforcement and getting away with crime. Whereas neg is going to come and say that it actually makes things really, really strong, because if you try to decrypt encryption, you make everyone's security weaker and you increase the risk of hackers and foreign adversaries coming and, doing malicious things. Also, if you do some research on the topic, you'll see that a lot of cryptographers have agreed that there's no lawful access only sort of solution, right? So that's something the negative is going to should come up and say in round. The affirmative is going to come up and say that, it's only lawful access, but it's important for the negative to have research, which there definitely is, that I've seen, that says that most expert cryptographers, both in the NSA and not, have, agreed that lawful access only is not like a real thing, right? A common saying is there's no backdoor only for the good guys. If you weaken encryption as a whole, you weaken it for everyone. All right, now let's look at some of the global context and what other like G7 countries and other countries have done in terms of, trying to solve this issue of going dark, right? So the UK has passed 2 acts, which has, sort of done the AF already, not to a great extent, but to a certain extent. Same with Australia. They've been able to they've been able to make companies decrypt certain data for law enforcement. So as you can, in the EU, while they do have strong privacy, they've all started to do it a little bit as well. So the general trend amongst major countries is that they're all trying to do something when it comes to decrypting, encryption to solve the going dark problem. The US has had a couple of legislative efforts, like the like this act that I talked about earlier, but it hasn't really been successful, and that's why we're debating it right now. The FBI's position is kind of trying to get the best of both worlds. They support strong encryption, but they also agree that people use it to, commit crimes. So they don't have like a super like strong point of it, but the FBI would be, an important organization in the government to bring up in cases, because they are probably going to be in charge of, going after these criminals post-AF, right? So assume in a post-AF world, the government does have the access to go into people's messages and look for crime with warrants. The analyzing this current status quo of the FBI is going to be important for both the AF and NEG. So like in NEG you can argue the FBI is weak and has a shortage of workers, etc., etc. If you can find research like that, you can argue that even post-AF, the FBI is not going to be able to actually crack down on criminals. So that means you don't get the benefits of the AF and you only get negative consequences. But something like that. It's important in both cases and also in the back half speeches to understand the status quo with the FBI and how they're going to be associated with the plan. So now let's go into specific AF arguments and negative arguments that I've kind of alluded to so far. The first is public safety. This is to be a super stock argument that is super rhetorically powerful as well. A lot of child exploitation, cybercrime, and terrorism plans happen through messaging. So with the affirmative, you can crack down on that faster and decrease child exploitation, decrease cybercrime. In fact, if you go to Google right now, you can see that the impact cybercrime has had is economically so big that it would be the size of if cybercrime was a country, it would have the third highest GDP behind U.S. and China. That's how big cybercrime is. Then terrorism obviously is a big impact as well. The second argument is the going dark problem. This is what's called as basically this is the way that these criminals avoid law enforcement, and hence you solve that problem. Upholding the rule of law is because in most other cases, when they can access the data and the court gives them a warrant, they can access on it. But now that you have a way where criminals are in a warrant-proof haven, there's no way for the courts to actually do anything. So a lot of the AF arguments are just going to be kind of crime related and solving crime, whether it be child exploitation, cybercrime, etc. Now let's go to the negative side of the debate. So the first is free speech. This is where people obviously have ideas and communicate, but when they feel that the government is now increasing in power and watching them, they might be hesitant to express their ideas. This is what's called chilling of free speech, where protests might decrease and advocates might be harmed, journalists might be harmed, etc. People advocating for things that might be against the current government's position will be harmed. Second is a rise of authoritarianism, and a good empiric that we didn't include in the slideshow is China. China does have a way where companies are required to decrypt stuff, but also that's caused. But in example of China has used that to kind of crack down on journalists and people just trying to express freedom of speech. So you could link that out to authoritarianism and free speech impacts. The third is economic harm, which is that for both small businesses and big businesses. So from the perspective of big business, the affirmative would require these companies to create something to go into to decrypt their messaging, right? And that would cause economic harm in two ways. The first is by most of these companies like WhatsApp and Signal and Instagram DMs, for example, they advertise that they are fully encrypted as a way to bring people in. So their consumer base might significantly decrease without encryption. But also more importantly, it'll take them time and it's just added regulation, which will burden them economically. That quote unquote regulation has a bigger impact on small businesses where more and more regulation makes it even harder and harder for them to process. as well as 99% of small businesses actually use encrypted communications, so it will make it harder for them to use it and less safer for them to use encrypted communications. And the last is a weaken in cybersecurity. This kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, but if you weaken cybersecurity for just for the intention of law enforcement, you weaken it for everyone. That's going to be a very common negative argument, and that's going to increase cybercrime overall, because then everyone's data becomes weaker in encryption. And yeah, that's it. So thank you for watching the amazing champion brief topic analysis. I hope it was helpful for you to get off the ground. You have these 2 months to do really well, get your TOC bids for this topic. So I recommend you start early so you can do well in late November and early December as well. Good luck in your rounds, and I'll catch y'all next time.